Uh, Hello, everybody. How you doing? I hope you guys are well. KP's in the house. What's up?
Hey, not too bad.
Yep. Hello.
Good. All good.
Good evening.
In the house.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, everything's well.
Okay, so we have a very, very special individual who's going to talk to us about international development. We have Lyndon Mukasa in the house, and I'm very excited to hear about his studies and his research into the gap between the rich north and the poorer south. Lyndon, how are you?
Very well, Solomon. How are you?
I am blessed and highly favored. It's good to see you.
Yes, indeed. It's good to see you as well. So I'm very interested, excited with this talk. So I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic, fantastic. KP, are you well? Are you ready to rock and roll?
Absolutely. I'm always ready to rock and roll. It's been a while since we've touched base, right?
It has.
So I'm really looking forward to getting, like what Sol says, when I first start off, we will be deep diving into all about Lyndon, and I'm really excited to hear from him and really get to know who he is and you know and what he's about. So yeah,
sounds good.
Lily.
Okay, fantastic. Without further ado, Lyndon, how's your day been, my friend?
Yeah, it's been all right. Just been quiet, relaxing. So it's Good Friday, so it's been a quiet day. Nothing much to do so far.
Good. And have you been good this Friday?
As good as I can possibly be.
Excellent, excellent. KP, jump in.
Right, so today, like we're gonna, so Lyndon, like I first wanted just for you to, like, really to give us a quick background. Who are you? What do you do? Yeah, tell us a bit about you.
Okay.
Yeah, go. You talk as go ahead.
All right. Well, I'm a former graduate of both Kingston University and London School of Economics. I've studied international development, or development studies as it's normally called, and hopefully in the near future I'll be doing my PhD as well in the near future. So my interest, my research interest focuses on the global south, but more I'm aiming to focus on the Caribbean and its development and its long-term development, the economic structures, and how it exists and how it interacts with the outside world today as well, and what that means for its future and long-term development. So, but that doesn't mean I'm exclusive to the region. I'm also interested in but the centerpiece of my research will be built around that in the long term. And that's the field I want to go into in terms of research and development in those areas. So I tend to be interested in how institutions and how structures in countries are built and how they run and how they function and how they build states. So but also work well as well.
Well, as you say, that sounds really interesting. And from my understanding, is that where you say you want to then go ahead and continue on your studies and go do a PhD? And
yes,
with your PhD, is that being more specific in the Caribbean, or
yes,
in that in that region of the world?
Yeah. The PhD will definitely focus specifically on the Caribbean, looking at with the rest of the world, in particular its trade relationships and how it can enhance its regional institutions such as CARICOM and use that to build upon and use for enhancing its development and responding to the global challenges such as issues of globalization, as well as its competition from the rest of the developing world as well, and being able to stay viable in the world today, in the increasingly changing world.
Right. And from when I met up with you first time, and our viewers can look at we've got a separate channel which is vlogs, and on there, that's the first time I meet you, Lyndon. And and you say to me that you've got your background is Guyana, right? So
Grenadian, half Grenadian, half Ugandan.
Half Ugandan, right? So that is why were you brought up in Grenada, or was it a case of is that why you want to concentrate in that area of your studies, and because of your roots, your family and where they're from and stuff?
That's a good question. I think my interest in the developing world started probably when I was a teenager. I was born here in London, but I moved to Grenada when I was a teenager. But I think because I had an interest in reading history and geography books years before, I was developing a greater interest in why are countries the way they are. I started to ask those questions from about 12 years old about why are countries the way they are, and becoming more aware and more interested. At the time, though, I didn't intend to study international development or economics and go in that direction or field yet. But when I did go to Grenada, moved to there, I went to school there and did my exams there. In the developing country, and I got the opportunity to see an interesting aspect of development that between, especially coming from London to the Caribbean, being able to see differences in small differences that you would take for granted. So differences in prices of the same products, differences in what the government was talking about, in what the priorities. So when I was there, a lot of people were aware of the existence of the IMF, for example, and what the IMF's influence is on the country. Over here in London, I don't know how many people outside of those who study economics or study the world are particularly aware or concerned with the IMF as such. But it was a very interesting contrast that was there. And then also, I mean, I would say in the Caribbean, there's a lot of, how to put it, the history I learned there as well from the lessons I had from my history teacher in particular, who was very good at integrating the Caribbean with the rest of global affairs, really started to move my interests very quickly and accelerate that deeply. So we would talk about global issues such as the Cold War and how that impacted the Caribbean. And this was from a perspective that we wouldn't hear about normally here in London. You don't hear about the Caribbean being discussed in relation to big global events. Over here in London, big global events are seen as parts of the Western narrative, where it's either the United States, it's either Western countries in Western Europe. So that really got me interested in seeing how the countries of the region interact with the rest of the world. At the same time, because Grenada is a small island, and you could see a lot of effects of development very quickly. When I moved there, it was just a year after a hurricane had hit the country. So we were seeing the effects of a lot of reconstruction efforts. The country was very busy. At the same time, we saw the effects of loans that the country had borrowed in order to pay for the reconstruction efforts as well. And it's a case of seeing development in your face right there. And I think that really started to combine that with the history and the geopolitical aspects of it, in which I was learning about Grenada and the rest of the Caribbean's relationship to the region, such as the United States and the rest of the Caribbean and the global South. It really started to push me in that direction of. I was talking about my background, how I got into. I was not entirely satisfied with at least some aspects of discourse on development. Not all, because there were lots of brilliant discourses on development that I became intrigued with. But I wanted to add my own aspect to research, and that became fascinating to me. I wanted to do research and in that area, and it was something that I was very interested in. I thought I feel I have a good perspective on it, and I think that the different work that I've done as well, that there's a perspective there of development that can be questioned, can be challenged, and can be explored as well. And it's not just necessarily models of development that focus on growth, but models of development that can focus on different aspects of sustainability, as well as we measure the quality of life as well in a particular place or region. So these are different things that came together to bring me to where I am today. But I mean, it's still a work in progress. I haven't got my PhD yet. Eventually, 2 years ago, I got my master's degree in LSC in development studies. So the next step is the PhD.
Oh, right. That's fantastic. And, congratulations on getting your master's.
Thank you.
That I'm sure that must have been a very challenging period.
Yeah.
But so I wanted, today's topic is going to be about, first, how technology has been a driver across the world and how that has affected the rich and poor gap, right? But before I start with technology, because of your experience with what you've learned in international development on an economic sense, right? Yes, technology is one particular type of driver, that is affecting. Do you want to give us a quick economic sense of how you feel in terms of how one country, say, in a developing or a mature country in a less developed, in a less developed area around the world, and how that and how what are the other drivers other than technology that is really causing why there's a big gap between the two.
Okay, well, that's a big question. There are lots of different factors the country developed and underdeveloped, and to what creates that gap in wealth and disparity between rich and poor countries. Using the Caribbean as a good template, one of the issues that it faces is high production. So the cost of producing has an impact in it growth. In addition to that, you have other regions in the world which are fairly isolated from trade and don't have access to be able to trade with other parts of the world as much as they could or would want to. Factors, more obvious factors, such as war, that contributes to long-term stagnation. And the longer the war, the poorer the country, because that means the more damage that's done to the country's infrastructure and capacity to develop, as well as destroying its human resource. Then you have other issues such as a country's ability or lack thereof to attract investment from other parts of the world, because we now live in a globalized world and in which money travels. a country that can attract money to it has a lot of potential, or is usually seen as a country or region that has the potential to develop a lot, which is what focuses on in Africa, in part of Africa and in China, where these are areas of high investment. With that said, governance is a big factor in development. The policies that a particular government applies to meet the challenges of development are crucial. However, there is no single model for development. And one of the things that I think a lot of people outside of this field don't necessarily understand is that I would say countries are a lot like people. They're individuals with different histories and different structures and different ways of doing things. And what one model that worked for one country will not necessarily work for another. In fact, sometimes in a lot of cases could even be disastrous. So if we're thinking of applying a South Korean style development model to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's not going to work because there's different aspects of both countries have different demographics, different population numbers, different challenges. I like to say that every country has a path to poverty and a path to wealth. It's just figuring that out, how to get to that path and keep away from slipping backwards into poverty as well. So there is the aspect outside of technology that affects development. And then, of course, you have countries, most countries in the world are the products of colonial domination in the last 60 years, and they recently became independent. So when you really have to when you really think about it, a lot of those countries are fairly young and fairly new and have had the luxury of 300 years of development on their own. And then we're in a new era where we have nation states, where we expect certain institutions to characterize a country or a nation that a country is built around. And now, and that has had a huge effect on countries that used to operate on totally different institutions in different ways. So we are in an era where development is not as easy as, say, 600 years ago, where a country could just go to war and conquer another country and then just rape and pillage it and of its resources and use that as to piggyback onto development. It's no longer like that. There's a new state system where countries now must find ways to cooperate and find ways to utilize markets and to be smarter. The governments have to be smarter or think outside the box sometimes, or even think about how they can approach the development, which is not an easy job, especially in the developing world.
Lyndon, could you perhaps give us an example of a nation state's cultural norms preventing it from moving forward in terms of receiving aid or any type of development programs that would greatly leverage the population out of poverty?
Okay, well, I wouldn't say that a cultural norm necessarily acts as a hindrance, but I would say that a nation's, a country with a particular history and a particular structure could, or way of life, could struggle with engaging certain institutions. And the best example to me that is probably the Horn of Africa region, in particular Somalia, which by all accounts, before it was established as a state, before and this is before colonialism, when the Italians and the British split it into two different Somalias, so to speak, there wasn't a concept of a Somalian state. There was different groups, different clans, so to speak, that organized themselves fairly successfully within their own systems. But then you had colonialism that established a state and more or less forced different groups of people to organize within each other. And I mean, this is not to paint Somalia in a blanket statement that it is, but it has had trouble meeting the challenges. On the other hand, within Somalia, there is a breakaway state, an unrecognized state called Somaliland, which has been quite successful in developing its own institutions without any aid or international institutions interfering with it. And it shows how within that regard, groups of people can come together. So there's a lot with the Somalian case. There's that example of how you have its own history, its own cultural backgrounds that impact its interaction with the rest of the world and international financial institutions as well, and its neighbors. But at the same time, within it, you have certain groups that have been able to adapt and repurpose their structures and institutions to meet the global challenges. And I think part of that which is why one reason why I didn't want to say cultural norms or say are the bedrock of or could it hinder a country, is because you see two Somalias, essentially one that did it their way with their institutions, and another that you could argue is seemingly being hindered by it. But I think they're both responding to circumstances and different challenges from the outside differently. They've decided to use, but they're both using their own background, cultural, historical backgrounds to influence that as well. I don't know if I made it clear enough, but I hope it's accurate.
No, you have. No, absolutely. So, thank you for giving your understanding of outside technology. Now, today's theme is really going to, we're going to concentrate on technology and how that has been a driver across the world, and where it has created inequalities of rich and a poor gap, right? So, in your opinion, Lyndon, why do you think technology is such a big driver across the world, and also give us some examples on areas, say if you want to talk about Grenada, for example, to say the North America or Europe, really, and give some some examples of that, of a country that is developing and then a country that is mature, and how they're using technology as a big enabler for them to grow, within the country.
Okay. All right. With regards to technology as a driver of development, one of the simplest ways in which technology can help with development is that it can, at times, lower production costs. So in a country such as Germany, Germany is considered to be a country that makes machines that other countries use to manufacture. A lot of times, that's useful. And Germany has for a long time been one of the leaders in making technology or producing technology that makes the production of other products easier and cheaper. Because if you could find or build technology that is cheaper, saves on energy, saves on paying labor, or reduces the labor intensity of a particular industry, then you're going to probably save a lot of money. It creates other problems, which I'll get to later, and I suspect you'll probably ask me a question with regards to the effects of that, particularly in the developed world. But that's one of the more obvious ways in which it happens. A poor country, lack of technology, can put it at a disadvantage. So using the Caribbean as an example, and when I'm speaking of the Caribbean, I'm referring to the English-speaking Caribbean, so Jamaica, Grenada, St. Kitts, St. Lucia. the Caribbeans hasn't the investment in the technology.
Well, hopefully it hasn't cut out again.
Global markets
There he is.
hasn't been there. Sorry? Yeah. And this hasn't been, this is part of a series of policies, even going back to the colonial era, which when in which Britain really it didn't really invest in the time to create the technology or export the technology to the region, or create the institutions to allow the population to build the technology in order to reduce the labor intensity of agriculture. Instead, what their policy has been historically is to focus on keeping the industry alive, in a sense, to keep employment available, but never evolve an industry. And then by the time these countries became independent, and the industry is thrown onto the global markets, there was no protection. They lost all the protection gradually from the 70s onwards into the 90s. The protections that they had enjoyed under with exclusive markets that insulated them from the global markets and competition, and allowed them just to trade a little bit of Britain to an extent, wasn't available.
Lyndon, I've got a quick question. Given everything that you said, and I understand it because you've explained it in a very magnificent way, but surely, I mean, I would say at least 90% of the planet has now access to the internet. Can you hear me, Lyndon? Lyndon.
Oh, could you repeat that again? Because I think you just cut off a bit.
No problem. So what I was saying is, you've explained the labor market and the challenges that that nation states are facing with regards to the influence of technology. My argument to you would it be fair to say, because now 90% of the globe is covered by some form of internet access, that actually one could argue that in terms of the labor markets still suffering, but actually there is more liberation within communities because of internet, because of communication, because now we have the ability and the facility to now trade online and to work online and to now have these tools at our disposals via the internet in order to transform one's community, hence lifestyle. What would you say?
You're absolutely right. But what I would say to that is that within the developing world, it is a case of easier said than done, because when we're talking, I mean, I suppose up until this point, we've been talking about technological development and exchange in a very general way, but it's multifaceted. So in certain regions of the world, you have countries that still, even though they have access to there are certain regions that may not be as efficient with power or energy technology. So the grid that would be needed to run electricity across and efficiently and consistently isn't there, which limits the extent to which the internet access and the use of the internet can be applied. And at the same time, you have that trade aspect, and because not everyone has access to the internet yet. I mean, we have a lot of people. I think we have over 1 billion, approaching 2 billion people that have internet access. But at the same time, we still have about 3 to 4 billion people who who have yet to access the internet consistently, as in having a home computer at home, or a PC or a smartphone device that they're within their homes. So it's costs affect that as well. And in the developing world as well, generally speaking, costs tend to be higher for purchasing the technology. With that said, what you've said is very poignant, because internet literacy is going up in the world, and the developing world a lot of countries in the developing world are making that a priority. I know when I was in school in Grenada, that was a big thing in the school, to make sure that people were literate. They were teaching to an extent coding and other aspects. And we have the growth of internet cafes as well, to mitigate that. But in order to launch whole industries, you need to address other structural aspects within the country, such as power and energy consistency, the cheapness of power and energy as well, because that's another factor. If energy is expensive, then businesses are less likely to operate at an optimum level that they probably would like to. So that's another fact that's at play as well.
Lyndon, what I know we're talking about economics and technology, and I don't want to go off kilter too much, but why do you think, in your opinion, we have a richer north and a very, very poor south globally?
All right. Well, the short answer, there's a short answer and there's a long answer. The short answer is colonialism. A lot of the the South are products of colonization. Some of them are artificial states that were created fairly recently, and some were countries that were under colonial regime where they were forced into, where they were only meant to produce primary commodities, so agriculture or extraction of natural resources. When you have a country that's built on that, then you won't have industries that develop or institutions that develop to enhance the human potential or the human resource in those regions. And then when these countries become independent, they are playing catch up. To that end, though, of course, because I'm not trying to paint the global South as this region where there aren't innovators or there aren't people. There actually is a huge amount. But the reality is that you have a world that has, over the last 3 centuries, been largely constructed around a few countries. And so, and while some would argue that you can't place all of this on colonialism, what about innovation, blah, 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 you can't deny that has a lot to do with it. I say that if certain parts of the world weren't colonized, so if Africa wasn't colonized, that there would be a superpower. No, I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that there are certain trade linkages that have been created that influence the direction of where trade goes, where wealth is built and gathers, as well as where relations are conducted. And when there's wealth, technology tends to follow. I mean, the Industrial Revolution in Europe had to be financed somehow. It didn't come nowhere. You can't. It didn't just come. There were people who were able to be creative and respond to needs at that period of time in the 18th and 19th century Europe. But at the same time, the capital to do that had to have come from somewhere. And European states weren't at a particular stage of development, and the ability to develop technology and to maintain a lead in that technology probably wouldn't have been as easy as it was over the last 3 centuries. So that's a big part of it as well. I'll say another part of it right now is you have the World Trade Organization today, which, I mean, you could argue is an extension of all of this system, but in focusing solely on them, you have now introduction patents on technology and other technological innovations, and because certain parts of the West in particular have had a head start against and they can patent certain technology and certain harder, even if you country in the developing world that develop something or have capacity to develop the same thing, because there's already a patent. A good example is Brazil and South Africa in the 2000s wanting to create their own version of synthetic antiretroviral drugs, which was challenged in the World Trade Organization because other developed countries, had already developed antiretroviral drugs, and they did not want the same level of they didn't want to see what they saw as a blatant copy of their technology innovations to be made. And so you have these blocks that have been put in place as well, that are currently in place as well, which makes it difficult for any would-be scientist or engineer or any innovator in the global south to make headway. And then another aspect is probably migration.
Right.
Because certain parts of the world are richer than others, you have poor regions, people who get educated, who especially might be scientists or engineers or working in any other STEM subject. They tend to go to places where regions and parts of the world where their industry or line of work exists, and where they can make a living as well, because that's generally what human beings would like to do at the end of the day. So this creates a brain drain in parts of the world. In the Caribbean, the Caribbean is the region at the moment that has suffered the most from the brain drain compared to any other region. In the 2000s, Africa had lost 100,000 of its statistics that immigrated to the United States. So you have a brain drain of people who can or who could contribute to the technology, but because of the circumstances and the political and the economic trends and difference between countries and regions, they have to, and many of them felt they forced you to go to other regions, other parts of the world in order to realize the potential.
Lyndon, can you just quickly explain what you mean by the brain drain effect for some viewers that don't understand that terminology?
Sure. Okay, the brain drain is a phenomenon where you have a country, it could be any country, but in the context of talking about the global south, I mean, it's the harm that it can do can be devastating to a country. So you have most countries have an education system, and people who become educated many people who become educated tend to migrate to areas or parts of the world where the line of work that they got the education in exists, or where there might be better opportunities economically for them. So we call this the brain drain because what it is that a country's losing its best and brightest people. And you have people who leave developing countries who are educated in certain areas who go to the developed world in order to work and help. And in effect, indirectly, they help boost the industries and help the growth of these other countries out of perhaps the global stuff and their home countries, perhaps, in many cases. And for example, in the Caribbean, when you have a massive brain drain, it makes it much harder for industries to develop, to grow. So if you have scientists being educated and they yet leave, you won't have a growth of a cancer research sector, such as, for example, you won't have the growth or find the growth in and in the sector of antibiotics or nanotechnology or any of those other innovations that we tend to see in the developed world. What you do see is a stagnation.
Yeah, no,
No, sorry.
no, thank you for your description on the brain drain effect. Now, I really wanted to come across and look at the economic side of the technology. So, you sent me a very interesting article about what's happening in the United States in terms of income growth with the rich compared to the poor, right? And how technology is really pulling that gap even further apart, because what it is, the income for, say, the top 1%, right, of successful people who are earning considerable amount compared to the poor, the income growth, as you see over the last 50 years, the gap with the rich, the income is increasing at a constant rate, and is quite high, but the poor gap is staying at the same kind of level, isn't it? And when you look at those charts, it's really scary how the middle class are being pushed out as well, because technology, with these roles that are produced from technology over time, will then be replaced, right? With technologies. We won't go into AI yet and those particular drivers, but in your opinion, is there going to be a massive gap between the rich and poor, and the middle class are really going to suffer because of technology? Both in regions that are developed, you've got areas of poor growth, and also areas within the developing countries. They're finding that the rich are getting so richer, and the poor are just staying the same, right? So, in your opinion, Lyndon, do you think that's going to continue on for the next, say, 20 years? And so what's your opinion on that?
Well, I mean, to be honest, we already have a huge gap in between rich and poor. What is going to happen, and technology might be part of it, but I think there are other factors involved as well, such as the ability of wealth creation and wealth distribution within a country as well. But with that said, will it continue? I mean, I can't see any policies over the horizon that's going to change that at the moment. But what I would say is that I suspect that at the moment in the developed world, we are in a transition point, because right now we're starting to see a technological acceleration, innovation starting to accelerate. And you're starting to see the automation of certain industries. So, I mean, if you go into your average supermarket now, you do see self-service checkouts. In the banks, you see self-service bank systems as well. And it's what is leading to is less and less need for non-skilled labor, because these are being taken, essentially being replaced by machines that will take over. Whether it would lead to a crisis or not, I cannot really say, because that really depends on the country at an individual level and what measures they're taking in order to mitigate that. So, for example, in this country, they are trying to push for or encourage the growth of people entering the STEM subjects. So that's science, technology, maths, and engineering. And to meet the demands, because what we're essentially seeing, we're at a transition point where we probably will need to have, at least our children will probably need to have certain subjects in order to get certain jobs, more so. The jobs that existed before, that were perhaps lower skilled, may not necessarily be around in large numbers as they are today. And countries, how well or how smoothly this transition happens really depends on how well countries in the developed world adapt to that change. And countries in the developed world are adapting at different rates. I believe Germany is doing a bit of a better job compared to Britain in that regard, with their retraining programs that they've encouraged. Although compared to Britain, Germany has higher job insecurity by comparison. So the picture is very uncertain at the moment. And there are a lot of debates on that issue, and it's very difficult to see where this will go. With that said, I'll say that technological change and innovation to a society is not new. It's not new at all. There have been periods of time in the past when countries and regions have had to go through transitions to new technology, and industries change, and people find ways to adapt to that. So if I'm going on strictly on history, you eventually things will middle out and people will adapt to these changes. People will probably adapt more technology into their lives and learn more, or the education system that they have access to, they will focus on different subjects, so to speak, rather than subjects that don't necessarily provide a return on job creation. There are probably, just as in Britain, there are moves to promote entrepreneurship. Those businesses that are perhaps technologically would probably perform a lot better than those who are not. And this is just me assuming at the moment, because there isn't any hard research to suggest that at the moment, because we're still in early days. But this is what it seems like the shape of the world is going in at the moment.
Lyndon, I was wondering, because you spoke about the penetration of technologies in the developed nations, I was wondering what the effects of technologies such as AI or technologies of this kind would actually have an effect on developing nations. Because on the one hand, we could argue, as you rightly said, that there are certain training schemes in Germany that are helping aspects of their own society to be retrained to cope with the pressures of these types of technologies. But I was wondering, in the developing nations, are they more protected because they are still underdeveloped, or in terms of the rate of development in comparison to Western nations, that actually you could argue that they still have this buffer zone?
You're right in some respects, because, for example, in some developing countries, I would say in certain parts of Africa, for example, where the certain technology perhaps, for example, in agriculture hasn't yet reached, it's allowed the labor force to still be engaged in that, and the rate of change hasn't been as quickly quick to make that labor market in that sector unstable or create job losses. With that said, within the developing world, every country is different, and there's some advantages that countries in the developing world are benefits from, and some disadvantages that the countries in the developing world may be suffering from as a result of it. A good example is Rwanda. Rwanda is a country that I would say is taken measures and thinking in the long term to integrate itself with the technology, the increasing its technology, in particular in the software industry and IT. So right now they're in the middle of building these cables that would make it the internet technology within the East Africa region, East and Central Africa region. And that potentially could be a huge launch pad for it into the information based technology, as well as access to other industries. The agriculture industry in Rwanda has been fairly insulated from that, those changes, in part because there's probably still a rural-urban divide with regards to where these technologies are expanding on. How Rwanda in particular adapts to that and the changes, and whether would really depend on the policies and of the government and where they want to take their country. So would they want the labor force of the country, which is still 65% rural, to enter the potential IT market that is developing? Or would they, which could potentially harm or create problems for their rural agricultural industries that they have? Or do they want to keep a balance? And how do they keep a balance? And these are the questions that leaders and policymakers in countries have to deal with and struggling with. At the moment, I'll say Rwanda's doing a fairly good job of that, because they've introduced IT in all of their schools, and they found ways around power limitations and inconsistencies by having solar-powered laptops. So a lot of students have access to that technology and are learning to be computer literate and able to, is preparing their countries for to be competitive in the next 20 to 40 years. But other countries may not necessarily be faring as well. In the Caribbean, again, you have countries such as Haiti that are still left out of that margin of development. They are, and it's in part because of the structures that are currently in place, how they are being encouraged to develop.
Right. So my question.
A whole podcast on. So, but it's very uneven. If different parts of the developing world are responding differently to the technology gap in the world today.
Okay, right. So, Lyndon, I wanted to talk about some major technology companies that are helping to foster technological change in remote areas of the world and helping those nations to really get onto the internet, right? So, for example, the Facebook, right? They've got an initiative going on, and that is called internet.org. And they've got they've created, for example, an innovation center that is actually trying to help these particular developing countries, especially remote islands, to get the internet. So, like, for example, they're trying this called hot air balloon, right? And they will be providing Wi-Fi, to that particular island, or or that particular country that's quite remote to the rest of the world. And so really, but my question to you is that, yes, they're providing this particular type of technology, but what is the true purpose that they're doing? They are helping. It's really great what they're doing, that education, teaching children. But I think that the data that they get with from these particular innovations is where then they're able to then monetize and then again profit from those particular areas. So my question to you is it a good thing what these major technology companies are doing for these developing countries? Or is it that they are, they might be doing a disservice in a sense to them, because they're collecting all of this data, and then what are they going to be doing with this data, right?
Yes, I, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, it's it's a tough one because on one hand you have regions that are fairly isolated and could being linked in with the rest of the world could be of great use to its development. So I've heard about what you mentioned with regards to the balloons that connect to remote islands to the internet. I haven't gone into too much detail in it, but I would say it's a 50-50 trade-off because the motivation for these companies will always be profit and data, generally speaking. So, and I think also to secure a market in places where their competitors haven't necessarily reached.
Exactly.
So if they can entrench themselves in a particular part of the world early, there and establish their brand and establish their presence there, it would be much more difficult for companies to from the outside or competitors to actually enter because of that established rapport with the people in the region. With that said, it also has an effect on the development of similar industries in those in that part of the world. I mean, companies such as Facebook and Twitter, they don't necessarily. I mean, they bring their industries and they bring their connectivity, but they don't necessarily create or provide capital that creates the new industries. I mean, potentially the positive side is that they provide the linked information that people could use to learn and increase their access to and means to create their own industries. But if these companies are already entrenching themselves in remote islands in the Pacific, for example, or in remote regions within Africa or Southeast Asia, then you're going to have a difficulty perhaps in establishing a competitive domestic company, and it effectively could potentially eliminate the growth of any domestic software or data type of industry that these companies are built themselves on. So there is that fear and challenge. But again, this is also early days as well to see how this develops and how this plays out. But in my opinion, that's where I see the direction of it going. But when it happens, these countries will have to find a way of navigating their way out of it, and how they do that would probably have to be with regards to adopting a set of policies that regulate how these companies extract information from their regions. And I mean, as what we're seeing today in the news with regards to the scandal that Facebook is in, that should be a useful template for what countries in the developing world, hopefully they're following this, should be expecting and should be thinking about in terms of drafting policies in how to respond to that and how to respond when companies are coming into the region. So because I mean, it's like how a country responds to the introduction of an aid agency or an IMF package. The governments effectively need to look at how it links in with their own policies and directions for development. And because history has shown that in a lot of cases it hasn't, in many cases it hasn't necessarily linked in, governments need to really think about the long policies and be cautious how much they integrate these systems and companies in their regions and in their countries. But I suspect that how they do that will be vastly multifaceted. The difference between how a Grenada lets Facebook in to say Botswana or Micronesia will be vastly different based on their interests and what they want out of it.
Right. Absolutely. So, like you say, it's a matter of that particular country or region to really set policies for their government in their governments to make sure that these particular major technology companies coming into their country, that they're fostering good and promoting, innovation for that country, but yet giving the opportunity for entrepreneurism. So people are then able to use the internet as a tool in order to provide services and then grow, within that country and help, sustain that country. But but with again, it's really great what you touched on with Facebook, for example, with exactly Mark Zuckerberg at the moment, what with his company, what he's going through about how they data mined, information, especially sensitive information of people, Facebook details, right? And then created these models in order to then really affect political systems, right? World. And so technology again is can be a great tool, but yet it can be used as nefarious activities for governments who want to use it to police particular parts of communities, within that country. So
I agree.
and so what I really wanted to ask you is, say for example, in Grenada, do you have like do you have local local technology companies that are fostering innovation, or do you have the major ones that are close, like say North America, like Facebook's, your Microsoft's, and your Apple? Is that all you have, like in terms of those particular types of technology companies that come into that come in?
In general, we have a lot of influence from American companies that do exist at the moment. I mean, I'm sure most people that I knew, at least at the time when I was in Grenada, were already Facebook users. But with that said, in telecommunications area in the sector, we have our own regional indigenous telecommunications industry. I believe it's I don't quote me on this, but I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, it's Digicel. I could, yeah, so I need to look it up, but there are some certain industries there that exist that are in the region that were created by companies in the region for the population there as well, and it's not necessarily outside.
No, that's good. And so, like what you've said about Grenada, now I want to ask you the question about China, right? Now, what China has done is they've got the Facebooks, they've got the Microsofts, they've got Apple, but what they've really done is they've kind of blocked particular channels on what information that can go into the country, right? They've blocked a lot of information, especially Google, right?
Yeah.
With Google,
Skype. Google and Skype, actually. Skype you can't use in China at all.
Yeah, exactly. So my question to you, Lyndon, do you think China's model, right, what they're using in terms of blocking particular types of connection, blocking these corporations on what they can fully do you think that's a good model that could be applied to other countries say in the developing world, where there are kind of policing what information that these technology companies are trying to gather and trying to profit from that?
I think it's possible in China because of China's own particular history of regulating certain industries to begin with. I'm not sure if that model will be effectively, even if it was attempted in its application, whether it will be effective in another developing country, especially a developing country that has completely different interests to China. So if you wanted to try and apply that to any country in the Caribbean, in particularly the English-speaking Caribbean, at the moment the discourse in the Caribbean is how to find a way to open up and benefit from globalization. And I suspect, I mean, I don't have, unfortunately, I don't have any of the Caribbean leaders on hand to quote from or to call to get their opinion, but I suspect that they would see a policy like that as restrictive to their growth or their potential of growth at present, because unlike China, which has a large domestic market that it could potentially grow off and develop off, which it has. It's always been able to buttress of that. Caribbean countries don't necessarily have that same luxury. And then you could even put that to another country such as Nigeria, which is an ally of the United States and an ally of many Western countries. And they won't, I mean, and at the moment, their goal is similar to the Caribbean, that they want to continue opening up. They're receiving a lot of investment. As far as they're concerned, the economy is growing, and it is growing very fast. Whether the wealth is distributed evenly and equally is another topic altogether. But at the same time, they won't. I can't see the Nigerian government, unless there's something inherently harmful or directly harmful that they could see happening from this expansion. I can't see them creating special economic zones in Lagos that, for example, to restrict trade only to there, or creating the Great Firewall of Nigeria, to in the same way that China has created the Great Firewall of
Lyndon, you there?
developing countries. Is that information and access to that information is the key to their way out of poverty and to their pathway to development. China has found a way to sort of do both, but it's because of the timing in which all of these policies have also been applied. China, we have to remember, developed before China's development really started to kick off before the growth of the internet. When you really think about it, so it could afford, in a sense, or has a luxury in that sense, to apply policies that limit it, because it's already managed to develop a large internet sector, and it can restrict the outsiders in the way that it wants it to, in order to serve its purposes. A country such as Grenada or any country in the Caribbean, which hasn't passed through that threshold that China has, is in the information age, and that would dictate how it would whether it would want to restrict certain companies from in being involved in its industries and its economic development.
Lyndon, why do you think China has taken so well to capitalism and still kept its communistic foundation? And if we were to compare that with Russia, how Russia, although is a vast country, the number one, it's the largest country on the planet, seems to struggle with both maintaining control in terms of its foundation, its heritage, but yet still needs that capitalism to keep the country moving forward. What is it about China that allows them to take advantage both of, if you like, capitalism and communism, and is able to do so well, intertwine both of these philosophies together enable to enrich the countries where perhaps a nation like Russia is unable to do that?
Well, part studying, if I'm correct, is it that what was allowed China to avoid a lot of challenges that Russia faces, and how China is able to be to whilst within its policies? If I mean, I'm just trying to paraphrase here. Say that the idea of China, China isn't really. The short answer to that is that it's, however, but yeah, you asking me a question, Solomon. Yes, China and Russia.
Yeah, what it was, Lyndon, because we were talking about applications in China being closed off, and you were given a very good reason for comparing Nigeria.
Yeah,
we're looking at China, and what came into my mind was you gave a very good explanation, but I think also at the same time we have to also respect the fact that Nigeria is not a superpower in the sense of the might and the will of China, number one.
Yes.
Number two, based on its geographical location, China is part of the richer north inherently. And that made me to think, while you were explaining the similarities and differences between the two nations, why is it that when you look at China, which by the way still is a dictatorship, still is a communist state, but yet they've embraced capitalism? And how is it that capitalism and the communist overview of that nation state are able to work hand in hand? And why is it that Russia, on the other hand, which is arguably still communist, arguably, allegedly, but yet when it comes to economics, they don't seem to have the fluidity of that of China? Why do you think that would be?
Well, firstly, I would say that I would argue against Russia being communist in any way, shape, or form. I would say that it's highly centralized. I would say that they would like to be more centralized, just like back in the Soviet Union days. But there is huge wealth inequality since the downfall of the Soviet Union that has been created. You've had the growth of a very, very wealthy elite in Russia over the last 20 years that has differentiated it. And one of the things we have to remember is that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and that has affected the way Russia developed from China. China never had a collapse like that compared to the Soviet Union. In fact, what China did is they adopted a series of reforms into the 70s, 80s that allowed it to open up its markets, but also retain a certain degree of state control. And it's a case of mixing, probably you could argue, the best elements of capitalism in order to create job opportunities, but still retaining state control in order to regulate the extent and to how it is distributed across the country, and how it operates. And because China has had that long period of time to do that in the modern era, it hasn't been able to perfect it and develop it further. Although you could argue that there's certain pressures that are going on in the country. I know certain experts on China would argue that there is that China's system is coming increasingly under pressure. But I'm in no position to argue one way or another. With regards to Russia, Russia is a country that was set back, arguably set back in 1991, at least economically, and it has struggled to recover. And in that period of time of recovery, you've had a certain degree of centralization implemented, but without the same level of growth, because during the 90s, Russia adopted a series of reforms that were largely ineffective, and it did not increase its ability to for investment or increase its ability of economic growth. In fact, it went through a long period after the Soviet Union collapse of decline, and it's only up until fairly recently that it's actually managed to exceed its Soviet levels economically. But in that space of time, the world has moved on. It's a case of right now Russia's caught up to where it was before it had that setback in 1991 with the disillusionment of the Soviet Union. But now it's tasked with a challenge of trying to catch up with the rest of the world in technology. And in that time, inequality has increased. This vast size of the country makes the difficulty in reaching certain regions higher, because at the end of the day, China and Russia are two different countries with two different sets of demographics, so to speak, and distributions of population, which makes that level of development much more difficult. China has much more larger, densely populated areas within it than Russia, and Russia is also dealing with hostile neighbors. Although China has hostile neighbors, but China isn't currently in conflict with those neighbors directly. It's at the moment playing a diplomatic game of chess to outmaneuver, but hasn't engaged in conflict, whereas Russia has within and outside its borders as well. So those are factors to consider in how and why China's development and Russia's development have been different and diverged somewhat since the 1970s.
Right. Yeah. No. That's a interesting and we kind of got off topic a little bit, and we're really talking about technology and how.
Yeah.
But it was a great. It's great. How you explained Solomon's question on that sense, and how really the aggressors, right? So you've got China and you've got Russia, and and again in a capitalist and communist sense, how is that intertwined and how's that working? But really, I wanted to really talk more about we haven't really spoken about artificial intelligence, right? And the advancement within that particular enabler is really, I think, in the next 10 to 15 years is really going to shape the world, right?
Yeah.
Because there's going to be modes of operation. They're going to be jobs, right, that used to be, based where people, that skill, was that you could really, that it was labor, right? But now with artificial intelligence coming in, it's really going to be a disruptor in the sense of these skill sets of people, especially in the middle, in the middle class, in the middle income areas.
Yeah.
And so with artificial intelligence, do you see yourself governments really stepping in and really taking hold of having regulation with artificial intelligence? And again, is that going to be a hindrance in growth with developing countries, in terms of them to really succeed within the technology race? And again, that question, it evolves around education as well, right? So what's your feeling on that side?
There will be some degree of government regulations applied, but that will really depend on how artificial intelligence generally shapes up. So we know that there are laws and regulations that are being governed around the extraction of data, which is gradually being handed over to AI technology at the moment in the developed world. So it really depends on the industries that grow out of it and how they affect people and daily lives and what the policy sets out to be. And it's a hard question for me to really determine that, because we're still on the cusp of AI technology and we don't know enough to know how it will impact the world. I mean, I suppose there'll be, and this is just me assuming, that there'll be certain regulations being put in place in terms of employment, for industries that wish to phase out employment to have a certain period of time. Certain redundancy payments will have to be made, and greater laws regarding that would have to be made. And of course, I think that countries will really have to focus on how they prepare the next generation of people, young people coming up, to work in the future industries that would exist, because certain jobs will just not be there for them to fall back on. In the developing world, it's really difficult to see how what this would mean for the developing world, because on one hand, there are two scenarios you could look at. In the developed world, you could see an increase in massive inequality that would, it would make, if labor if the unemployment increases due to the increase in technology across industries, and if AI takes over and fills in too many sectors or sectors very quickly before the labor market could adapt in these countries, then you could see massive swaths of inequality that would lead to a lot of discontent in the West. How that would affect developing countries? Ironically, in certain regions, middle-income developing countries, such as the Caribbean or Southeast Asia, it could very well lead to a slowing down of the brain drain that we discussed earlier. People who are leaving their countries to find work in developed countries may find that because there isn't enough work in those developed countries, they would be better served finding work in their home countries. It could very well lead to a shift in certain industries as well. Certain countries would probably move industries to other countries, or labor will start to move to other countries from the developed world to the developing world where they can get work, and how that will shape the developing world, that we don't know. In fact, we don't know if that will necessarily happen, but these are possible ideas of what could happen if we have the increase in AI. I think, again, the gap will still be there.
Right.
That's the thing. And the developing countries will still have a hard time, just as it's hard enough to bridge that gap as it is now. In that sense, I don't think there'll be much of a difference. I think inequality will just be hardened, so to speak, rather than softened, in the sense that outside of multinationals bringing their technologies to the developing world, what you're going to see is developing world countries finding it harder to create their own industries within their own countries because of competition, and being subject to copyright laws set by the World Trade Organization, and as well as the simple fact that demand may not be as high yet for AI. I mean, I can't imagine a self-driving bus being popular in Grenada when people when it's driving across over the mountains and around that. I can't just, I mean, it sounds tongue in cheek, but I can't imagine that being too popular anyway, even if whether it's a foreign company that wants to bring it in, or someone there, an innovative and creative person who wants to build it. I can't see it. So I don't know certain industries will necessarily grow or spring up anyway in the developing world, but I do know that the same inequalities that exist in terms of the technology gap between the global north and the global south will probably be hardened, and it will be much more difficult to bridge without introducing foreign companies into the regions.
Absolutely. So you're really saying is investments. Investments are key from, say, developed countries, to really help these developing countries to prosper, based on on technology, right? And so in terms of artificial intelligence as an investment, for a developing country, yes, it will able to help its economy grow, because some of the roles that were labor intense are now it's replaced by robotics, right? Or
Yeah.
processes that are automated. But what I'm really concerned about in that sense is in these developing countries, the gap that it will take in order, because technology is advancing at such a rapid rate, right? And the developing countries are trying to build institutions for education, to help adopt these technologies within it. It's got to be a race, like it's got to be a very tight, it's got to be a very, not a big gap at the race from investments from technologies coming in, providing these solutions to grown-based solutions. It will take a very long time for a developing country to build up its workforce, to have those particular skill sets that the developing country has, right? And so these developing countries have got, it's like you say, it's a tight rope, right? It's letting these investments in, these investment companies, bringing money into the organization, into the country, but yet how much can you bring in order to to prosper and to grow? But in my personal opinion, it's better to provide tools, right? Rather than giving them the full product. I feel that these investments companies should come in with an idea, and then place a seed into that country, and then allow that particular country to grow itself, and to to foster technology, and then get these institutions to then like then try and grow into how they want to take this technology forward, rather than being forced by an outsider to come in. So my question to you, in that sense, is what is your opinion in terms of what the balance of how they should balance in terms of education and technology, right? And how, and the pace at how it should go.
The pacing is different for every country. So that's that already is, I mean, there's no way to say, I mean, I suppose a good way to say a country can develop at a fast rate if its institutions are strong enough to take it. So if there's a strong education system, if there's a strong financial sector, if there's a strong if there's industries and policies that are supporting job growth and the economy is expanding, then these are favorable conditions, I think, in which a country can adopt technology and move forward with it at an accelerated rate. I would imagine that in the absence of institutions or strong institutions, whether it's in education or even its banking sector, then it would be incredibly risky, or even could lead to unequal development, or and that if we were to promote that at stage of that country's development.
Sure.
With that said, though, one of the things, because I don't think developing countries are an impossible bind. As I said earlier on, there's always a path to development that countries must always find a way to develop from. Each country has their own path. And a good example is India and Israel, which utilize their diaspora communities very well to develop their software and security industries, respectively. That relied on the linkages of their diaspora communities elsewhere in the world that would eventually come to their countries. I mean, that and help spring up these industries, under the policies that their countries adopted, they helped to support and provide financial support and in order to allow these industries to grow. And you're starting to see this process in India in particular really take off, with India is having its own version of Silicon Valley, for example. So it's not impossible to imagine that other regions in the world could utilize that as well. Yeah. So that is something that could happen in the future, in the coming decades. But we'll have to, again, when we're looking at the effects of AI and the technological growth, everything is at this point still speculation at best.
Sure. So finally, before I wrap up, Lyndon, so just wanted to, for a conclusion really on our topic today. We've spoken a hell of a lot about technology.
Time really flew by.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. So really, in conclusion, my question to you is: we've spoken a lot about technology today, and it's definitely technology is a huge major driver for every country, both developed and developing, and each market is, again, have got their particular point of advancement in their technology. But how do you feel in the next say 20 years? Do you think developing countries are able to kind of compete? I wouldn't say majorly, but have some sort of footprint, where they are able to stand and and to be successful in this ever-changing economy?
I think there are a number of countries in the global south that will be making their presence felt increasingly over the next 10 to 15 years. You have Nigeria, you have Brazil, you have even Bangladesh as well, that are working on industries, whether it's in nanotechnology, satellite technology, and telecommunications, as well as aerospace, developing the aerospace industries that and possibly will be could be potential big players on the global stage. You can see certain changes across parts of the developing world, where you're starting to see countries utilizing the technologies at the disposal. So smartphone technology is growing in Africa and in the Caribbean, for example, and you're already starting to see those starting to apply their own innovations to meet the challenges of development. So I can see that there will be some sort of change over the next 10 to 15 years, where you'll start to really feel the presence of certain countries. Not all countries, of course, but you will hear of potential countries: Indonesia, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Brazil, possibly Ghana, Mexico. These are countries that we can look out for in terms of see their future development and their progress in those areas. And other countries will probably start to pick up over the next 50 years. The best way to describe our period of time now, as of this recording, is that we're in a transition point, and we don't know have all of the answers to where we're going, but we can see that there is a direction that we're going in. We just don't know the end point yet. It's not going to be negative necessarily, all negative. It's going to be positive. I would say it's going to be a shade of gray, just as much as today's world is a shade of gray, a mixture of advantages and disadvantages. So over the next 50 years, you're going to see positive responses to the challenges of globalization, the challenges of the technological gap in the world, but you'll also see negative side effects to that as well. And I mean, as humans do, we'll have to learn to adapt and learn to cope with these challenges.
Well, it's been a great conversation with you, Lyndon. You've given us some great insights on your topic, and especially around technology and international development. And I thank you enough for coming on today and giving your talk. So I'd like to wrap it up. I'd like to thank everyone. So Sol, do you have anything else that you want to say? Or
well, no, I just want to thank Lyndon for his time. I think that actually Lyndon dropped so many nuggets of gold that we definitely have to have him back on and to continue this, because I know that people listening will be a little bit disappointed that we haven't gone deeper, we haven't gone further, because the conversation has been so interested. But I think because of the time factor, we've got to be a little bit disciplined. So what we'll do, we'll break it up into a 3-part series where we will continue with this particular topic point, which is the convergence of international development and AI technology, because it is important, and certainly we are going to see some type of after effects. And as Lyndon said, we don't know when, but it's just a matter of how it's going to take place. So I thank Lyndon for his time.
No problem. Pleasure.
No, it was our pleasure. Also, you really you dropped some bombs on us, and whoever will be listening to this on Facebook.
I can't believe how much time has passed since we started talking. It feels like half an hour.
I know, right? It's so annoying. I know. But definitely, if we can perhaps get you on, and maybe slightly at an earlier time, then we can really go for it and really try and flesh out. I mean, we don't obviously have solutions, but we want to give our audience some really tangible meat, and also we want to broaden our own understanding of international development. And you have the advantage because you've studied in these key areas. So with that being said, Lyndon, thank you so much, and I can't wait to have you back on again. It's going to be amazing.
Definitely. Thank you.
Appreciate you, brother.
All right, thanks very much.
Speak to you soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.